Footsteps echoed through the extraction zone, but they belonged to only one operator. Lieutenant Sabine Benson dragged a high-value target across the gravel, her tactical gear shredded. Her squad had not perished. They had deliberately left her behind. This is the classified truth of Operation Obsidian Wraith. Operation Obsidian Wraith was never supposed to be complicated. On paper, it was a textbook snatch and grab authorized at the highest levels of the Pentagon. The target was Elias Corrington, a former intelligence contractor who had gone rogue. Corrington had embezzled heavily encrypted drives containing the true identities of deep cover operatives embedded within global private military companies, including heavily guarded networks tied to Constellis and Defy International. If those drives hit the black market, decades of intelligence architecture would collapse overnight. Lieutenant Sabine Benson adjusted the night vision goggles mounted on her fast helmet, the green phosphor illuminating the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Syrian-Iraqi border. As the first female operator to earn her trident and secure a spot in DevGR's elite echelons, Benson was intimately familiar with the suffocating weight of expectations. She had bled, fractured bones, and pushed her body past the threshold of human endurance just to stand on this rocky ridge. Yet despite her flawless operational record, a subtle, icy barrier remained between her and her squad. The squad was led by Senior Chief DeAndre Russo, a man whose reputation was carved from 20 years of relentless warfare. Flanking him were Petty Officers First Class Callan and Everett, two heavily bearded, heavily armed ghosts who communicated with Russo through mere glances. Benson was the outsider, the attachment assigned by command to replace a wounded operator. Target compound is 300 meters, Russo whispered over the encrypted comms, his voice a low, mechanical rasp. Heat signatures confirm 4 hostiles on the perimeter. Corrington is likely in the subterranean bunker. We breach, we bag him, we exfil to Point Bravo. Copy that, Benson breathed, her finger resting rigidly outside the trigger guard of her suppressed HK-4 Sting. The approach was flawless, moving like shadows detached from the night itself. The 4 SEALs neutralized the perimeter guards with terrifying efficiency. A pair of synchronized suppressed shots dropped 2 sentries instantly, while Callan and Everett quietly dispatched the remaining 2 in close quarters. Benson stacked up behind Russo at the heavy steel door leading to the bunker. With a silent hand signal, Everett planted a specialized breaching charge. The muffled detonation blew the hinges inward in a cloud of pulverized concrete and dust. Benson was the first one through the threshold, her weapon snapping to the corners of the dimly lit subterranean room. "Clear," she announced. "Clear," Callan echoed. Sitting calmly at a metal desk in the center of the room was Elias Corrington. He didn't look like a man whose life was about to end or vanish into a black site. He wore a tailored linen suit that looked completely absurd in a concrete bunker, and he was casually sipping from a glass of bottled water. The encrypted drive sat stacked neatly on the desk in front of him. "You're late, DeAndre," Corrington said smoothly, not even flinching at the 4 laser sights painting his chest. Benson frowned beneath her tactical gaiter, her eyes darting toward her squad leader. "DeAndre?" Russo lowered his weapon slightly. "Shut up, Corrington." Hands on the table. "Oh, let's skip the theatrics," Corrington chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "The wire transfer cleared 30 minutes ago. $15 million. Distributed across 3 untraceable offshore accounts in the Caymans. Just as we agreed, you get to retire as kings, and I walk away to a waiting helicopter provided by my friends at Aegis Defense Services." Benson's blood ran cold. The silence in the bunker suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. She kept her rifle trained squarely on Corrington, but shifted her peripheral vision toward Callan and Everett. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither of them had raised their weapons toward Corrington. "Russo," Benson said, her voice tight, commanding the authority of her rank despite the shifting dynamic. "What is he talking about? Secure the target." Russo turned his head slowly to look at Benson. The green glow of his envy jizz masked his eyes, but his posture had changed. The rigid discipline of a Navy SEAL had dissolved, replaced by the relaxed, dangerous stance of a mercenary. "Change of plans, Lieutenant," Russo said quietly. "Command pays us pennies to risk our lives in the dirt, while guys like Corrington make billions. We've done our time. We've paid our dues. Today, we get what we're actually worth." "This is treason," Benson stated, her grip tightening on her rifle. Her mind raced, calculating the angles, the distances. 3 highly trained operators against 1. She was fast, but nobody was that fast. "Stand down, Senior Chief. All of you. Secure the drives and the target, and I'll pretend this conversation never happened." Everett let out a dry, humorless laugh. She really thinks she's in charge. Benson, listen to me," Russo said, taking a slow step toward her. "You're new to this level of the game. The government won't miss Corrington. They'll sweep this under the rug. Walk away with us. You get an equal cut. $5 million. You can vanish. You don't have to keep proving yourself to a chain of command that just sees you as a PR stunt." The insult stunned, but her training overrode the anger. "My duty isn't for sale. Drop your weapons." She shifted her aim from Corrington to Russo, but before she could fully pivot, Callan moved. A deafening crack echoed in the confined space. Callan hadn't shot her. He had fired a flashbang directly at her feet. The detonation was blinding, a concussive wave of sound and light that completely overloaded Benson's senses. She stumbled back, ears ringing with a high-pitched squeal, her vision reduced to a blinding white haze. She tried to raise her rifle, relying on muscle memory, but a heavy blow struck the back of her knees, buckling her legs. Before she could recover, the butt of a rifle slammed brutally into the side of her helmet. The world tilted violently, and darkness swallowed her. As consciousness slipped away, the last thing she heard was Russo's voice, distorted and distant. "Strip her comms. Rig the bunker. We tell 2C she took a fatal hit during a secondary explosion and the target's body was unrecoverable. Let's move." Pain was the first thing to return. It didn't arrive slowly. It crashed into Benson like a freight train, radiating from her skull down to her spine. She gasped, inhaling a lungful of dense, chalky dust that immediately sent her into a fit of violent coughing. She forced her eyes open. Absolute, impenetrable darkness. Benson tried to bring her hands to her face to wipe the grit from her eyes, but her wrists wouldn't yield. Thick, industrial zip ties bound her hands behind her back. She was lying on a cold, uneven concrete floor. Her helmet was gone. Her rifle, her sidearm, her radio, her emergency beacon all stripped. Russo, Callan, Evada, Corrington. The memories flooded back, sharp and agonizing. Her own squad had sold her out. They had taken the money, taken the drives, and left her to die in the dark so they could pin a botched mission on her corpse. Panic, primal and desperate, clawed at her chest, but Benson ruthlessly clamped down on it. Panic was a killer. She forced herself to breathe in measured, controlled counts. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. She was Lieutenant Sabine Benson. She had survived the freezing surf of Coronado. She could survive a concrete box. She needed to assess the situation. Russo had mentioned rigging the bunker. That meant there was an explosive charge somewhere in this room, likely set on a delayed timer to give them enough time to exfil and establish their alibi. How long had she been unconscious? 5 minutes? An hour? She had no way of knowing, which meant every second was borrowed time. Benson rolled onto her side and dragged herself into a seated position against the nearest wall. She began to rapidly rub her bound wrists against the sharpest edge of the concrete she could find, but the heavy-duty plastic barely scratched. It would take hours to saw through them this way. She needed her hidden ace. Soon into the inner hem of her uniform trousers, near the right ankle, was a micro-ceramic razor blade standard issue for Sire, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape situations. Contorting her body, she brought her knees up to her chest and desperately tried to reach her right ankle with her bound hands behind her back. Her shoulders screamed in protest, joints popping dangerously, but her fingertips finally brushed the hem of her pants. She pinched the fabric, feeling the tiny, rigid outline of the blade. Ripping the seam with her fingernails, she extracted the razor. It was impossibly small and slippery, but she managed to wedge it between her fingers. With excruciating care, she maneuvered the blade against the thick plastic binding her wrists. Slice, pull, slice, pull. The blade bit into the zip tie, and after 2 agonizing minutes of sawing, the plastic snapped. Her arms fell forward, numb and tingling with returning blood flow. She didn't pause. She immediately began feeling her way around the pitch-black room. The heavy steel door they had breached was gone, but the doorway was entirely blocked by massive chunks of collapsed concrete and rebar. Rousseau had already blown the exit. "Think," she muttered into the dark. If the main door was sealed and a secondary charge was ticking down, she needed a structural weak point. During her brief visual sweep of the room before the betrayal, she had noticed a grated ventilation shaft near the ceiling on the far wall. She scrambled over the debris, her hands scraping against sharp rocks until she found the smooth metallic surface of the wall. She climbed onto the metal desk Corrington had been using, reaching up into the dark until her fingers hooked through the metal grate. It was bolted tight. Suddenly a faint, rhythmic beep echoed from the opposite side of the room. A digital timer. Beep, beep, beep. Benson didn't have tools. She had to use raw, brute force. She planted her boots firmly on the desk, gripped the grate with both hands, and threw her entire body weight backward. The metal shrieked, beep, beep, beep. It was accelerating. She pulled again, her muscles tearing, roaring with exertion. With a sharp crack, the rusted bolts sheared off, and the heavy grate came loose, sending Benson tumbling backward off the desk. She hit the floor hard, scrambling instantly back to her feet. Beep, beep, beep. She threw herself into the narrow ventilation shaft just as the secondary charge detonated. The shock wave was a physical entity, a massive hand that shoved her violently up the shaft. A deafening roar consumed the world, and a wall of scorching heat and debris blasted up the tunnel behind her. The concrete structure beneath her collapsed entirely, leaving her clinging to the sheer dusty walls of the vertical vent as the bunker below was reduced to a tomb. Coughing up blood and dust, Benson dragged herself up the remaining few feet, pushing through an exhaust grate and spilling out onto the cool, starlit desert floor. She collapsed onto the sand, gasping for the crisp night air. Every inch of her body ached. She was bruised, bleeding, and entirely unarmed, stranded in hostile territory with no comms. By all standard military metrics, she was effectively dead. But as she looked up at the vast and different sky, the shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. Rousseau had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that removing her weapons removed her lethality. He had forgotten that a seal is the weapon. Benson pushed herself off the ground, standing tall against the desert wind. She scanned the terrain. To the north, the faint tracks of heavily armored SUV tires, likely the extraction team sent by Aegis to pick up Corrington and her treacherous squad, were visible in the lunar glow. They wouldn't be heading straight to an international airport. They would need a private, unsecured airstrip to smuggle out a high-value target and 3 defecting Devdaru operators. There was an abandoned petroleum facility about 12 miles northeast, a known staging ground for black market smuggling flights. That was where they were going. She had no water, no gun, and no backup. She had 12 miles of hostile desert to cross. Lieutenant Sabine Benson wiped the blood from her chin, set her jaw, and began to run into the dark, stepping directly into the tire tracks of the men who had murdered her. The hunt had begun. Midnight winds whipped across the desolate Syrian expanse, carrying the bitter chill of the desert night. Exhaustion was a luxury Lieutenant Sabine Benson could not afford. Every muscle in her body screamed in agony, her bruised ribs grinding with every inhaled breath, yet her pace remained a relentless, punishing jog. 12 miles of unforgiving terrain stretched between her and the abandoned petroleum facility. She navigated by the stars, her internal compass locked onto the coordinates she had memorized during the mission briefing. Survival training dictated conservation of energy, but tactical reality demanded speed. Aegis Defense Services contractors operated with military precision. They would not keep a multi-million-dollar extraction flight grounded on a dirt runway any longer than necessary. Benson pushed her body into the red line, relying on the sheer indomitable willpower forged on the grinder in Coronado. Shadows finally began to coalesce on the horizon. Rusted silos and the skeletal remains of refinery towers jutted into the night sky like the bones of some colossal beast. Benson dropped to her stomach, belly crawling up to the final sand dune to establish a vantage point overlooking the facility. Illumination was sparse, provided only by the harsh glare of halogen world lights mounted on a pair of armored Chevrolet Suburbans. Idling on the cracked tarmac of the compound's makeshift runway was a Pilatus PC-12 NGX turboproper, highly versatile aircraft favored by private contractors for its ability to land on unimproved surfaces while carrying significant payloads. Dawson, an Aegis mercenary wearing a heavy plate carrier over a tan combat shirt, was pacing near the aircraft's fueling port. Beyond him, standing near the SUVs, were the architects of her demise. Senior Chief Russo, Callan, and Everett stood in a loose semicircle around Elias Corrington. The rogue intelligence contractor was clutching a sleek titanium briefcase containing the encrypted drive. Voices carried over the open expanse, snatched by the wind. Benson focused intently, watching the body language. Something was wrong. The transaction was supposed to be complete, yet Russo's posture was aggressive, his hands resting far too close to the sidearm holstered on his hip. Agreements change, Corrington. Russo's voice drifted faintly across the dunes, laced with cold malice. You transferred 15 million, but I know for a fact the director of operations for Triple Canopy is willing to pay double that just to keep these drives out of Constelli's hands. I think we'll be taking the briefcase too. Corrington took a step back, his arrogant facade finally cracking. You gave me your word, DeAndre. The Aegis team won't let you just walk away with my property. Oh. But Russo let out a dark, guttural laugh. Aegis? You mean the 2 pilots and the 3 ground crew. They don't have the firepower to stop DevGru operators. Moving with lethal fluidity, Russo drew his suppressed pistol and fired 2 rapid shots. The Aegis guard standing nearest to Corrington crumpled to the tarmac. Instantly, Callan and Everett raised their rifles, training their sights on the remaining mercenaries near the Pilatus. A tense, deadly standoff froze the tarmac. Benson realized this was her only window. The chaos of Russo's double cross provided the perfect acoustic and visual cover. She slid backward down the dune, sprinting low and fast toward the unguarded eastern perimeter of the facility. She needed a weapon, and she needed it now. Navigating through a maze of rusted shipping containers, Benson stalked her prey. She had spotted a lone Aegis sentry patrolling the rear perimeter, blissfully unaware of the Mexican standoff unfolding on the tarmac. Benson melted into the deep shadows cast by a towering oil derrick. As the sentry walked past her position, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, she struck, covering his mouth with her left hand to muffle any outcry. She drove the micro-ceramic serra razor deep into the vulnerable carotid artery on the side of his neck. The sentry convulsed silently, fighting for air that would never come before going limp in her grasp. She lowered him quietly to the dirt, stripping his gear to less than 30 seconds. She secured his tactical vest, a suppressed Glock 19 sidearm, 2 spare magazines, and a SIG MCX Virtus assault rifle. Racking the charging handle of the rifle, the metallic click felt like an old friend welcoming her home. She was no longer a victim. She was the apex predator, and she had returned to the top of the food chain. Flames erupted from the fueling station as Benson initiated her assault. Before leaving the shadows of the containers, she had fired 3 suppressed rounds into the high-pressure aviation fuel pump, followed by a tracer round stripped from the sentry's magazine. The resulting explosion was spectacular. A fireball roared into the night sky, throwing the entire tarmac into blinding, chaotic light. Shockwaves knocked Corrington to his knees, while Russo, Callan, and Everett instinctively dove for cover behind the armored suburbans. The remaining Aegis mercenaries, assuming they were under attack by Russo's men, immediately opened fire on the SEALs. Gunfire tore through the night, shattering the windows of the SUVs and sparking violently against the fuselage of the Pilatus aircraft. Benson didn't hesitate. She moved like a phantom through the perimeter debris, flanking the firefight. Her objective was not to engage the Aegis mercs. They were merely a convenient distraction. Her targets were the traitors wearing the trident. Everett was the first to expose himself. Peeking out from behind the rear tire of a Suburban to return fire on the mercenaries, he failed to check his blind spot. Benson brought the SIG MCX to her shoulder, settling the holographic sight squarely on the center of his chest. 3 suppressed bursts tore through the night. Everett's body armor caught the first round, but the next 2 found the soft gap under his arm, piercing his lungs and heart. He collapsed instantly, his rifle clattering uselessly against the asphalt. Callan saw Everett fall and spun around, sweeping his rifle toward the darkness where Benson was concealed. "Contact right! Contact right!" He screamed over the comms, laying down a blanket of suppressive fire toward the shipping containers. Bullets chewed through the rusted metal inches from Benson's head, but she had already displaced. Crawling beneath a flatbed trailer, she acquired a clear line of sight on Callan's legs. She fired 2 precise shots. The 5.56mm rounds shattered Callan's kneecaps, dropping him to the ground with a howling shriek. As he fell, exposing his upper torso, Benson double-tapped his center mass, silencing him forever. Only Russo remained. Sensing the sudden, terrifying efficiency with which his squad had been dismantled, Russo realized this was no ordinary ambush. The Aegis mercs lacked this level of surgical precision. Panic, a foreign and unwelcome emotion, began to gnaw at the edges of the senior chief's mind. He grabbed Corrington by the collar of his suit, hauling the terrified contractor to his feet, and using him as a human shield as he backed slowly toward the open door of the Pilatus. "Start the engines," Russo roared at the terrified pilot cowering in the cockpit. Benson stepped out from the shadows of the ruined fuel pump, bathed in the flickering orange glow of the raging fire. She lowered her rifle slightly, her gaze locked onto Russo. Russo froze, his eyes widened in absolute disbelief. "Benson? No, that's impossible. You're dead. The bunker, you always were sloppy with your explosive yields, DeAndre," Benson said, her voice a dead, icy calm that cut through the roaring flames. Let the target go. Russo tightened his grip on Corrington, pressing the barrel of his pistol against the side of the contractor's head. You don't want to do this, Sabine. I have the drives. I have the target. If you shoot me, he dies and the mission fails anyway. Walk away. Take the plane. I'll even leave you the 15 million. Just let me walk into the desert. And calculations raced through Benson's mind. Russo was entirely covered by Corrington's body. A headshot was too risky. If Russo flinched, the bullet would kill the high-value target she was sworn to bring home. She needed to close the distance. Dropping the SIG MCX to let it hang by its tactical sling, Benson raised her hands in a placating gesture. Okay, DeAndre, you win. Take the drives. Just let him go. She took a slow step forward, then another. Russo sneered, misinterpreting her movement to surrender. Smart girl. You finally learned how the real world works. As Russo slightly lowered his pistol to push Corrington away, Benson exploded into motion. She didn't draw her sidearm. Instead, she sprinted the final 10 yards with terrifying speed, drawing the combat knife she had looted from the sentry. Russo realized his mistake a fraction of a second too late. He raised his pistol to fire, but Benson slid sharply on the blood-slicked tarmac, dropping beneath his line of sight. She drove her combat boot upward, executing a brutal kick that shattered Russo's wrist. The pistol flew from his grasp, firing wildly into the night sky. Before Russo could recover, Benson was on her feet. She grabbed the collar of his tactical vest, pulling his off-balance weight forward, and drove the hilt of her knife ruthlessly into his temple. Russo staggered, dazed, but his sheer size and decades of combat experience kicked in. He tackled Benson around the waist, driving her hard into the side of the Suburban. Air rushed from her lungs as her already bruised ribs took the brunt of the impact. Russo's massive hands locked around her throat, squeezing with lethal intent. I should have put a bullet in your head myself, Russo spat, his face twisted in rage. Black spots danced in Benson's vision. She couldn't pry his fingers loose. He was simply too strong. But she didn't need to overpower his arms. She reached down, her right hand blindly patting Russo's tactical belt, until her fingers brushed the cold steel of his backup blade. She unclipped it, reversed her grip, and drove the blade upward, sinking it deep into Russo's thigh, severing the femoral artery. Russo roared in agony, his grip on her throat instantly releasing as he reached for his leg. Benson didn't give him a chance to recover. She spun around him, hooking her arm under his chin in a flawless rear naked choke. She locked her arms in place, applying immense crushing pressure. Russo thrashed violently, blood pouring down his leg, his hands desperately clawing at her arms. But Benson held on, her resolve forged in the fire of his betrayal. Slowly, the thrashing stopped. Russo's eyes rolled back, and his massive body went limp, sliding to the tarmac. He would bleed out before he ever woke up. Benson stood over him for a long moment, gasping for air, rubbing her bruised throat. The sounds of the desert night slowly filtered back into her awareness. The Aegis mercenaries had fled the compound in the remaining functional SUV, wanting no part of the massacre. The pilot of the Pilatus had locked himself in the cockpit. Corrington was curled into a fetal position near the landing gear, clutching the titanium briefcase, trembling violently. Benson walked over to him, her shadow falling across his terrified face. She reached down, snatching the briefcase from his white-knuckled grip, and hauled him to his feet by his expensive linen collar. Elias Corrington, Benson rasped, her voice rough and exhausted. You are in the custody of the United States government. Using the secure SATCOM radio stripped from Russo's vest, Benson dialed into the Joint Special Operations Command emergency frequency. She bypassed the local Tactical Operations Center entirely, patching straight through to JSOC headquarters at Fort Bragg. Thunderbird Actual, this is Obsidian Wraith Element 2, Benson broadcasted, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. Primary target is secure, drives are secure. Obsidian Wraith Element 1 is KIA, hostile defection confirmed. Requesting immediate medevac and extraction at my coordinates. I am returning alone. Footsteps echoed through the extraction zone an hour later as the heavy thumping of an incoming MH-60 Blackhawk tore through the silence of the dawn. Lieutenant Sabine Benson dragged the high-value target across the gravel, her tactical gear shredded, her face painted in dried blood and desert dirt. Her squad had not perished in combat. They had deliberately left her behind. But they had failed to understand one fundamental truth. You can strip a SEAL of her squad, her weapons, and her support, but you can never strip her of the mission. Did this intense tale of betrayal and survival keep you on the edge of your seat? If you love this deep dive into the shadowy world of elite operators and tactical espionage, hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more gripping, real-life inspired military stories. Drop a comment below with what you want to hear next.